My name is David Edimo. As Melissa and Angela said, I am the student member on the Maryland State Board of Education, and more importantly, I'm a senior and proud to be a senior at Richard Montgomery High School in Montgomery County. So again, I want to begin by thanking Melissa and Angela for setting up this great event. I've only met a few staff members so far at the State Department of Education, but when I learned that they have close ties to Montgomery County, they won me over. So this is the first ever Maryland Teacher Leadership Summit, and I'm very excited to see how it turns out. I'm glad that we're here in Annapolis at the beautiful Philip Merrill Environmental Center. This is the second time I've been in this facility, and the first time was in 2013 for an executive board meeting of the Maryland Association of Student Councils. And I mention this because I want to speak today about student leadership, not just to extol its virtues, but also to draw a contrast between what we're doing now in the student leadership world and what I think we ought to be doing. And I want to talk about the lessons that I've learned and how that can apply to your leadership endeavors and what you can take back to your districts. And at this point, I should be clear that my statements are made in my individual capacity and not as a representative of the State Board of Education. Now, if you were present at that 2013 meeting that I talked about, you would have seen a group of students who were full of enthusiasm and vigor and who were committed to the idea of improving our schools. You would have also seen that that group, for all its merits, was rather homogeneous. It's a sight that's mirrored in student government rooms all across our state, in our middle schools and our high schools. And I offer today that that sight is a sign of a major disconnect between what student government claims to be, what student leadership claims to be, and what it truly is. And what do I mean by that? If you go to any member of any student government in any school in this state, probably this country, and you ask them what they do, to speak about their job, they'll inevitably use the phrase, the student voice. The reality, however, is that a large number of student leadership organizations, as a result of their homogeneity, represent not the student voice, but a student voice. And to be frank, I can't say that there really is the student voice anywhere, but we can critique the idea when it is abused, as I believe it has been. Now, last year I served as the president of the Montgomery County Regional Student Government Association, and my first task after I was elected was to assemble an executive board. And at the onset, I made clear to my officers that I would seek an executive board that was diverse in all forms. Because after 6 years in student government, I've seen the drawbacks of organizations dominated by students with the highest grades and the longest resumes from a few of the wealthiest schools in our jurisdiction. I was not just going to seek a staff that looked different, I was seeking a staff that lived differently. And in a place with 1 million residents and countless demographic identities, I was sure that I would find what I was looking for. I take pride in having appointed what I view as a diverse board, but it still wasn't as diverse as I hoped it would be. There are still a disproportionate number of students from our higher socioeconomic status schools, still largely the same old cast of characters. And during that process, I learned that it's not only unconscious biases that affect representation in student leadership activities, but also a lack of awareness and a lack of expressed interest. I was shocked by how few applications we received from students at underrepresented schools and from members of underrepresented minority groups despite our efforts. There are standard explanations for lower participation in extracurricular activities, higher rates of at-home obligations, lack of reliable transportation, and so on. But I believe that the lack of expressed interest and the lack of awareness goes beyond that. I believe a partial explanation is that we have cultural norms that effectively exclude some groups from seeking positions. Student government at the school level and at the county level look different. Where a school level SGA may focus on planning events, a county student government will focus on lobbying. And so even though these two types of organizations are different, they share a same name and the same perception of being a popularity contest, which I don't believe is entirely true of school SGAs, but it's certainly the prevailing view. Now, if some groups feel like they're less likely to win a popularity contest, they're less likely to even try. And the effects of this don't bode well for us. I and many others agree that there's a link between performance in school and enthusiasm. When you have a stake in the game and when you feel invested in your school and your school community, you do better. The kid who takes pride in their song selections for the winter dance may be a bit more focused in English class. And while I have the floor and your attention, let me throw out the idea that perhaps more members of student council should be selected rather than elected, because being thrust into new desks can make for a better student. We should scrutinize regressive policies that stop academically challenged students from serving in their student government organizations, and in so doing, compound and reinforce the divisions between students and their representatives. Institutions garner more trust and are more effective when they look like the people that they serve. Take the words of Drew Faust, the president of Harvard University. In her 2015 commencement address, she said, "Institutions embody our present and enduring connections to one another. They bring our disparate talents and capacities to the pursuit of common purpose. At the same time, they link us to both what has come before and what will follow. They are repositories of values, values that precede, transcend, and outlast the self. They challenge us to look beyond the immediate, the instantly gratifying, to think about the bigger picture, the longer run, the larger whole. They remind us that the world is only temporarily ours, that we are stewards entrusted with the past and responsible to the future." So I ask, what are the values that our student leadership organizations display? To a student with a 1.9 GPA who already faces low expectations from those around her, who looks at her student government representatives and says to herself, well, these are my leaders, they're 1,000 times smarter than me, they look nothing like me, and they're the ones whose opinions matter, those values must be pretty discouraging. Because there's a harmful underlying assumption that members of student governments have a monopoly on leadership and a monopoly on having their voices heard. The assumption is perpetuated in the policies that I mentioned, by the members of these groups, and in the minds of students. I don't believe it's malicious, but I do believe that the effects are negative. I believe that we have two options. We can either work to broaden the institution of student government, or we can try to redefine what a student leader really is. And for our purposes, let's talk about how we change the perception of what a student leader is. My anthropology teacher, Todd Stillman, told me recently to remember that this whole endeavor that we're engaged in, creating the thorough and efficient system of free public schools promised by our state constitution, comes down to the goal of helping young people become contributors, citizens, and caring human beings. We need to send a message that all students are capable of reaching that goal, and today I'm going to offer 4 strategies on how we can do so in the classroom. Number 1, connect with students, learn their stories and motivations, and try to understand them. You only have so much time during a day, but if you make a student feel valued by showing curiosity about their lives outside of your 45-minute period, you can build a trusting relationship that can result in increased engagement in the classroom. You can take a minute before class starts and strike up a conversation and remember what's said for next time. That's how you make friends, and it's how you can turn students into partners in the learning process. Number 2, instruct students to answer questions that other students have and affirm when that answer is correct. In so doing, you not only allow the students to demonstrate knowledge of the material, you also empower them. Number 3, continually solicit feedback on instruction, not just at the end of a semester or at the end of the year. Feedback doesn't have to be collected formally. Asking a student what they thought of the lesson for just a few seconds after class goes a long way, takes a little time, and lets them know that their opinion is valued. Number 4, for administrators especially, gather input on issues from students outside of the traditional student leadership organizations. Make sure people know that you don't need to be part of a club to be heard, you just need something to say. And I'll give you an example of this. In the past 1 or 2 years, there's been a lot of discussion about school dress codes. Not just the actual specifications, but questions about equity and about fair enforcement. More fundamentally, there are questions about our core values as a school community. This was a question that I encountered firstly in middle school. I particularly remember spending half of a 7th grade biology class, which was the period directly after lunch, so it was already a recipe for intrigue, of course, with my classmates discussing the enforcement of the dress code. I didn't really hear much about the issue again until my most recent year in school. This time, the conversations were not just about girls getting dress coded more than boys. It was about whether some students perceived, it's about what some students perceived as sending the wrong message about responsibility, about expectations, and freedom. When confronted about this question, my administrators didn't brush it off as they could have, but they also didn't just ask our SGA president what he thought. Instead, they reached out to students who felt affected by the issue and allowed them to recruit students to form a sort of work group to develop potential solutions. No matter where you stand on the question, this route, engaging students who are not formal leaders, is laudable because it gives a wider range of students a sense of political efficacy. I also want to share one other strategy my school has implemented. Every so often in class at Richard Montgomery, you'll see a student be delivered a slip of colored paper. And when they get over the panic initially of thinking about how they're going to explain whatever they did wrong to their parents, they look down and they realize that it's in fact an invitation from the principal. And I guess it's an invitation much in the same way a subpoena is an invitation to have lunch. These little student lunches allow our administration to hear from students and allow students to get free food, so it's a win for everyone involved. My teacher, Mr. Stillman, also taught us to embrace positionality, so I am going to disclose mine because bias can't be completely overcome, but it can be acknowledged. As Melissa and Angela said at the start, for 6 years I've been involved in student government. I am a pretty decent student with the privilege of attending a special academic program, and I have the privilege of being a member of the State Board of Education. So, in other words, I'm in many ways the kind of student who is already overrepresented in student government organizations. So, of course, you can take all of this with a grain of salt. But while I would much rather someone in another position and in another situation give this talk, I've given you my honest assessment of where we stand. So why should you care as teachers? You all will go back to your districts with a great experience and you'll have the mark of a leader. And with that designation comes a lot of responsibility. So I want to impress on you today the importance of humility. Don't back down from challenges or from making change as you all are capable of doing, but understand that you alone cannot possibly represent the teacher voice, just a teacher voice, a refined teacher voice, of course. It's a distinction that seems meaningless and seems inconvenient, but it's a distinction that in its own self-effacing grace empowers everyone around you. You're here, I hope, not just that you can become a better teacher or a better administrator, but so that others in your school can also become better. Let me finish by saying this. Building better schools does not stop with you. It involves all teachers, all administrators in the building and its central office, all support staff. It involves all students and all parents. The topic of student governments may seem small and peculiar, but to involve all students requires a critique of the institutions that we have. Imagine a PTA without the parents or without the teachers. Such a group would be illogical, it would be unrepresentative. Building better schools includes the work of local boards of education, of the State Board of Education, and though many across the spectrum don't like to admit it, the federal government too. While sometimes there may be questions and disagreement on policy, you can rest assured that student leaders and that the State Board of Education stand behind you and stand beside you in the pursuit of better schools for our children. I look forward to working with you, and I hope that you'll all be in touch. Thank you, and have a wonderful summit.